Well, if you've ever experienced brokenness in your life, if you've ever done something you regret, if you've ever thought that maybe God may not be able to forgive you or use you, then today's story is for you. Maggie Baratto is passionate about seeing people healed, both body and soul, because she's experienced radical, love-filled restoration in her own life, and she's here today to share her story. Thank you so much for coming.
It's an honor to be here, Cheryl.
You know, we mentioned off the top of the program today, you're doing so much. You're the head of the healing rooms across Canada, which is kind of like a walk-in clinic for healing prayer. Mm-hmm. You have a home for women who've been trafficked and exploited and are addicted. You have a boutique that funds all of that, where you sell used clothing, beautiful used clothing, Cinderella's Boutique. So you're doing so much in ministry, but it's a lot. You've come a long way from where you started, and that's what I love about your story, and that's why I asked you to come on after I met you. You know, you started as a teenage runaway.
Yeah.
When you were how old?
15.
And why did you leave home?
When I was 15, I left home because I guess I grew up in a Christian home, and it was on a farm, and there was a lot of rules, and I guess I just didn't like the rules, and I just decided I was going to go out in the world. And I thought God was boring. I attended church a lot when I was young, and I thought God was boring, and I just felt like I wanted to go out in the world and make something of myself.
That youthful pride that we get so many times. You went out and you ended up not having such a great time in the end. You were in abusive relationships. You ended up with 3 different children from 3 different men, and you were in a shelter as well. Tell me about that.
Well, when I was 18, I got pregnant. When I left home, I sort of lived by my wits, lived on the streets, and just hung out with whoever, and got into drugs, alcohol, lived a promiscuous lifestyle. And then when I was 18, I got pregnant, and I ended up marrying the father, who was really abusive. So I ended up in and out of women's shelters, and that was a very tough time for me. Yeah.
And this trend continued into the point that you were pregnant again. This is with your 3rd child, right?
Second child.
Second child, okay.
Yeah.
And then at some point you said to God, if you'll give me a father for my children, I'll do whatever you want. So kind of one of those desperate, like, I'm going to negotiate with you, God, prayers.
Yeah. So what happened was I had 2 children with 2 different fathers, and then I got pregnant again, and the father of that baby decided he didn't want to be a father, didn't want to marry me, and so he left me. So there I was 4 or 5 months pregnant, and that was pretty devastating for me because I just felt so ashamed. So I felt so guilty. I felt like nobody would want me, you know. And I remember being really angry with God. I mean, I wasn't serving God. I was living a pretty party girl lifestyle, and I just couldn't believe God would allow something like that to happen to me.
Don't you love that? We don't even believe in him, but we're mad at him anyway.
Yeah. So one night, I stayed at my mother's house, and I remember I was pretty low. I wanted to die. I was so ashamed. That rejection just had a real grip on me, shame. And I remember laying in bed, and this cry just came out of my heart. And I just cried out to God that night, and I said, God, I will make you a deal. If you give me a father for this baby, I'll do whatever you want. And I meant it, because everything had accumulated to that point where all I wanted was to give this baby a father. And so that was it. I went to sleep. I got up the next day. I put one foot in front of the other, and life continued. So I'm about 5-6 months pregnant, and I've got 2 little ones. I was in university at the time, and I was working full time. And about a couple weeks later, I got a phone call from this guy named Eddie. And I just have to stop there for a minute, because Eddie was a guy that I had met a few years prior. And Eddie was one of those nice guys who had a job, and he was really kind. And so I wasn't really wanting to have a relationship with Eddie, because I was always attracted to men that were alcoholics or into drugs and that kind of thing. And so he just called me out of the blue, and he would do that. Every 6 months, he would call me and say, hey, and ask me out. And so at this time, he calls and says, hey, how's it going? And I said, well, I'm pregnant, and this and that's happening. He says, well, it sounds like you could use a friend. So Eddie started visiting me and hanging out with me and the kids. And I got later in the pregnancy, I ended up being hospitalized. So he was there, and we spent a lot of time together. In the delivery room, Eddie was there watching the birth of the child, of my daughter, Natalie, and helped me pick out a name, and came to visit me in the hospital, brought me gifts, you know, for the baby. And and we were dating. And so I remember my baby, Natalie, at the time was 3 months old, and I was in my bedroom, and I was folding laundry, and she was laying on the bed. And this is the day that changed my life. I felt a presence. I knew it was God's presence. Don't ask me how I knew. I just knew it was God. Walked into my bedroom, and I heard a voice say to me, "Do you remember what you promised me?" I kept up my end of the bargain. And I had forgotten all about that cry so many months before.
I know, as soon as things get better, right?
Yeah. And I remembered crying out for a father for my baby. And in that moment, I realized that God had brought Eddie into my life, because he was going around telling everybody about this new daughter, and he was so proud of us. And that was the furthest thing from that night that I cried out for a father. I had never expected that. So in that moment, when God said, "Do you remember your promise?" I felt the kindness and love of God overwhelm me, because I realized he had heard my cry, and I realized he cared about me. He cared about a single mother who had screwed up everything, and I wasn't even serving God. And so I literally fell on my knees. And I said to God, I said, "You know what? If you can do that, if you can intervene like that in my life, I'm giving you everything. I will do whatever you want." And something happened to me that day. It's like my heart was changed. I felt rejection and shame. I felt so many things leave me in that instant, because I knew that I had a Father in heaven who loved me. It was just like a father's love just overwhelmed me.
You say that was the day you became a daughter, that so many of us, even us that know Jesus, still live out of that orphan spirit. You know, we're always expecting to be criticized or rejected, or we're not quite good enough. Or, you know, people come to Christ with a past like yours or other things, and they feel like they're kind of like a B grade Christian, or never can quite be used by God. Like, how do you overcome those things?
Well, that day, it was like I knew I was loved by God, and something shifted in me. I could hear God's voice. I did not desire to do the things that I had done before. Suddenly I knew that I was valuable, that God had a plan for me, that I was destined for something more than what I was doing. And that is like I started to come into an understanding of my identity, that God chose me, that God had a plan for me, and that he was personal, that he was making himself so personal in my life.
And he has that for everyone. I mean, that's kind of our message as followers of Jesus. But you know, you can hear it, but when sometimes God has to get it into your spirit, into your heart, into your identity, like into the very depths of your being. You do that work. How hard is it sometimes for us to realize that that's not just true for the person sitting next to me, but God has that for me?
Yes. Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. I read a sign on the way up here today, and it said, "Find yourself and then be that." And I believe it really is about coming into a relationship with the Father. And because he's the one who designed each one of us, knowing your identity, knowing how he feels about you, knowing what he thinks about you, and feeling that way about yourself and thinking that way about yourself.
And you had more healing to do after that. It wasn't like, you know, you gave your life to Christ, you said whatever you want, but there was some more work that he did in you. What did he do?
A long journey. A long journey, and just healing, and a lot of emotional healing. I remember I was addicted to cigarettes, and you know, God doesn't do everything at once. So a couple years after that incident, I remember one day smoking a cigarette, and I was actually weeping while I was smoking, because I was smoking against my own will, and I'm smoking a cigarette going, I don't want to do this. And I heard the Lord. It was like Jesus was beside me, and he said, "Maggie, I want to be your next drag." And I got a revelation that, you know, what I was looking for in the cigarettes, that peace that you know, take a drag, you know, and I was looking for peace. I was looking for calm, and I wasn't getting it from the cigarettes. And Jesus was really the real thing that I was looking for. And so, since that day, I was able to put my cigarettes down and allow God to become my peace, to become that comfort that I was looking for, and so many other things.
I love that, and you are doing so many cool things in ministry, and there's amazing God stories in all of it, like just how God sets things up and these great stories. And we're going to tell more of that in January, actually. I'm producing a piece on the healing rooms that you're doing and the ministry that you're doing, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But you have come such a long way. And you said to me before this interview, sometimes I can't believe that God has done this with me, that this is me.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people feel that way. I have friends, they went through a painful divorce and they don't feel comfortable going to church because they feel like maybe they're being judged or people look at them differently or they're just not good enough or people think they're just not good enough. We all have these things around us. What would you say to that person who really has been held back from really fully loving God and really finding their destiny because of mistakes that they are making or have made? What would you say to them?
Oh my gosh, I would say that if you feel like the least likely, then God's probably got his eye on you. Because I've always believed that I was the least likely person, and God found me in the midst of it. And it doesn't matter to God, because it's not about your past or where you've come from. It's about what he thinks of you and the design that he has on your life. So I would just say, you know what, if God can do this with me, he can heal anybody, because I wasn't really looking for God. I just wanted to get free from the rejection and the shame I was feeling. So I believe there's hope for everybody.
One of the things that I love about, even in my times with God and what I see with other people is that he speaks to where he sees you will be.
Yeah.
He never speaks to where you're at.
Yeah, that's right.
It's always about the potential and where he knows he's going to take you. And so many times you're going, that's not even possible. There's no way I can do that.
Yeah.
But he knows because he's the one who's going to get you there.
Yeah.
Right? It's not about you, Maggie, getting yourself there and fixing yourself up and being good enough. It's that God is transforming us day by day.
Yeah, yeah. When that happened to me in my bedroom that day, suddenly it was like God just gave me this passion and desire for the nation of Canada. I never had that before the day God started to reveal himself to me. But as the days went on, I started to have these visions and dreams and just insight into what God wanted to do across the nation of Canada and have this passion. So I believe that the closer you get to God, the more you take on his original design, his destiny that he has for you.
And you are speaking into the future of Canada. You have a passion for this nation. There's so much more about your story, and hopefully we're going to bring that in the months to come. Maggie, thank you so much. This has ended way too quickly. Loved having you here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, if you're watching this and you're thinking that you're one of those people that God can't use, that you've done too many bad things, that you've made too many crazy decisions, that you're too wounded, that you're too hurt, just all the things that the enemy throws up in our face about our past, Maggie is here to tell you today that nothing is impossible with God, that no one is beyond the love of God. If that's you today, give our prayer lines a call. Let us pray with you. Let us make a fresh start with you today, where you can start on a new path of discovering what God has for you. Give us a call.